Let's talk about money and credit. I mean, they're two things that are so deeply a part of our lives, we barely even notice them anymore. But have you ever stopped to really think about how they work? Well, that's what we're going to do today. We're going to peel back the layers and see how these forces truly shape our world.
So here's a fun question to kick things off. Why can't you just walk into a store and trade a cow for your weekly groceries? It sounds a little ridiculous, I know, but asking that question actually takes us to the heart of why money was invented in the first place. It helps us see the huge problems people faced in a world without it.
All right, so let's jump in our imaginary time machine and go back to a time before money existed. In this first part, we're going to explore just how messy and complicated life could be under something called the barter system.
Okay, so picture this. On one side, you've got a shoemaker. He makes great shoes. On the other, a farmer with a ton of wheat. The shoemaker needs wheat to feed his family, and he's totally willing to trade his shoes for it. Simple, right? Well, not so fast. What happens if the farmer turns around and says, "Sorry, buddy, I've got plenty of shoes. What I really need is some new clothes." Now what? The deal's off.
This exact problem, this massive headache, actually has a name in economics. It's called the double coincidence of wants. It's that super rare, magical moment where what you want to sell is exactly what the other person wants to buy, and what they want to sell is exactly what you want to buy. In a barter system, you had to find this perfect match for any trade to happen, and you can imagine how incredibly difficult that was.
And this is where money just strolls in and changes the entire game. Suddenly, the shoemaker doesn't need to find a farmer who's barefoot. Nope. He can sell his shoes to literally anyone for money, and then take that money and go buy wheat from any farmer he wants. Money acts as that go-between, that middleman. That's its most fundamental job, to be a medium of exchange.
Okay, so we've officially left the barter system in the dust. Now let's jump into the present and look at how modern money works, because it's way more than just the cash in your pocket. It's all tied up in our banking system.
You know, what we've used as money has changed so much over time. Way back in ancient times, it was stuff like grain and cattle. Then, for centuries, we used precious metals. Gold, silver, copper, coins, things that had value in and of themselves. And that brings us to today, where we use currency, the paper notes and metal coins we're all familiar with.
Now here's a wild thought about the money we use today. That paper note in your wallet, it has no real value on its own. It's just a piece of paper. The only reason it works, the only reason we all accept it, is because the government says it's valuable. In India, it's the Reserve Bank of India, the RBI, that issues currency. And because the government backs it with a promise, nobody can legally refuse to accept it as payment. It's all built on trust. But modern money isn't just physical cash. There's another huge piece of the puzzle: demand deposits. And that's just a fancy term for the money you and I keep in our bank accounts. It's called a demand deposit for a really simple reason. You can withdraw it on demand, anytime you want. You can write a check, swipe a debit card. It's all a way of using your money without ever touching a single bill. This all leads us to the crucial role of banks. Think of banks as the great matchmakers of the economy. They take in all those deposits from people who have a little extra cash. We call them savers. And then what do? They lend that money out to people who need it, the borrowers. Banks are the bridge that connects the two, making sure money doesn't just sit around, but gets put to work. And that whole business of lending brings us to our next big topic: credit. Credit is an incredibly powerful tool. But you know, it's also a double-edged sword. It can be a lifeline that helps people grow and succeed, but it can also be a trap that pulls them under. It can really go both ways. To really get this, let's look at two very different stories. First up, we have Salim, a shoe manufacturer. He gets a huge order, takes out a loan to buy the materials, works hard, delivers the shoes, makes a tidy profit, and pays back the loan easily. For him, credit was like a rocket booster for his business. But then you have Swapna, a small farmer. She takes a loan to pay for her crops, but then disaster strikes. Pests wipe out her entire harvest. She can't pay back the loan and ends up in an even worse position than before. Swapna's story is just a heartbreaking, classic example of what's known as a debt trap. A debt trap is this vicious cycle where you end up having to take out a new loan just to pay off your old one. You're just digging a deeper and deeper hole that becomes almost impossible to climb out of.
So how do lenders try to protect themselves from this risk of people not paying back? Well, when you go to a bank for a loan, they'll almost always ask for something called collateral. Collateral is basically an asset you own, like your land, your house, maybe your car. It's a guarantee. You're telling the bank, hey, if I can't pay you back, you have the right to sell my house to get your money.
But what happens if you don't have any of those things?
What if you don't own land or a house to offer as collateral? That single question right there is what splits the entire world of credit in two. It creates two completely different systems, one that's pretty safe and affordable, and another that's incredibly expensive and risky.
We call these two worlds the formal sector and the informal sector. The formal sector is what you probably think of. Banks, cooperatives, they're supervised by the RBI, they have clear rules, and the interest rates are reasonable. But then you have the informal sector. This is moneylenders, traders, even employers. There are no rules here, no supervision, and the interest rates can be sky high, designed to trap people from the very start.
And this chart really shows us the reality on the ground in rural India. Now, it's good to see that about half of all loans come from commercial banks. That's progress. But look closer. A massive 23%, almost a quarter, still comes from moneylenders. That just shows you how powerful and frankly how dangerous that informal sector still is.
And this chart, well, this one really exposes the deep inequality in the whole system. It asks a simple question: who gets those cheap, safe loans from the formal sector? And the answer is pretty stark. Rich households get 83% of their loans from formal sources. Even well-off households get 73%. But what about poor households? Only 46%. That means more than half the time they're forced to go to those expensive, often predatory, informal lenders.
So the big question is, what can we do about this? How can we fix this massive imbalance? In our last section, we're going to look at a really clever and powerful solution that's trying to make affordable credit something for everyone, not just for the rich.
So first, let's just nail down the core problem one more time. Why do banks so often turn away poor people? There can be a few reasons, but the biggest hurdle, the most common roadblock, is the lack of collateral. Millions of people just don't have land or a house to offer up as a guarantee. It seems like an impossible problem, right? But out of this challenge, a powerful grassroots solution has emerged. Self-help groups, or SHGs, which are very often started and run by women in rural communities.
The way these SHGs work is just beautiful in its simplicity. It starts with a small group, maybe 15 to 20 women, who all agree to pool their savings regularly, even if it's just a tiny amount. If a member needs a small loan, she can borrow it directly from the group's savings. Now here's the magic. Over a year or two, as the group builds a track record of saving and repaying on time, banks see that they're reliable. The group's discipline itself becomes the collateral. And suddenly, banks are willing to lend to the whole group without asking any one person for a guarantee.
Professor Muhammad Yunus, the founder of Grameen Bank, who actually won a Nobel Peace Prize for this kind of work, said it perfectly. If credit can be made available to the poor people on terms and conditions that are appropriate and reasonable, these millions of small people can add up to create the biggest development wonder.
And with that powerful idea, we're at the end of our explainer. But I want to leave you with one last thing to think about. In your view, what is the single biggest step we as a society could take to make sure that absolutely everyone, regardless of how much they have, can get access to fair and affordable credit? The answer to that could change millions of lives.